afternoon and welcome to Harmonizing Agility and Discipline. My name is Keith Ellis and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances here at IAG Consulting. Today's webinar is a tough one for everybody. I mean, there is a lot of passion around what is Agile, what is Waterfall, what are all these other methodologies, how do I go about implementing this stuff, how do I make it work within my organization. Hey, I'm a big shop, I'm a bank or an airline or a transport company, and I've got a lot of legacy stuff. How do I take some of these disciplines and put them into what I'm trying to do today? And so much of this discussion today is going to be about really separating out fact and fiction. I mean, the great thing about modern methodologies is that the people backing them and behind them are becoming fantastic marketers. I mean, let's face it, I would love, who doesn't want something that's agile? Who doesn't want agility in their organization? But one thing I can absolutely guarantee you is that I don't want a waterfall coming down through my office somewhere. The market has changed a lot. There's a lot of new stuff coming in. This discussion is for people who really want to get balance out there and want to achieve success. We're going to run a full hour. There's a lot of material in here. People who have come in and seen these discussions from me before know that I try to pack as much as I possibly can into an hour of your time because your time is so valuable. At the end of the session, the last slide, there will be the PDU information that everybody's looking for as well. We will I'll be taking questions as we go. So if you want and you want to put your questions into this, the little interface there, pop it in there. I'll try to make this as interactive as I possibly can. Now, we have about 850 people coming onto the line today, so I may not get a chance to answer every single question that everybody's got, but I'll try as I go forward. And certainly if I miss your question here, then I'll try to get back to you before the end of the week, okay? So with that, let's continue to talk about this because we've got such a full agenda. Today, we're going to talk about really improving satisfaction with the development effort. At the end of the day, that's everybody's goal, is to improve satisfaction with that development effort. And I'm likely, and I hate to say it, but I'm going to put it right up front here, guys, I am likely to annoy method purists out there. I'm going to try to simplify things as I try to do in these sessions. I'm going to try to simplify things. That means I've got to take it up a level to look at, hey, what is it that all these methods have in common? Why are we trying to do this? And why would you want to go with an agile approach when you're dealing with a very, very large shop? What kinds of things can you do? What kinds of things can you implement? If you're having problems with that approach, what can you beg, borrow, and steal from other methods? If you're much more into a disciplined methodology, how do you get much, much faster iteration, much, much faster cycles, et cetera, in there to take from Agile what really works there and start blending that into your shop so you get better performance? We really come from a complex organization background. IAG, we tend to deal with very, very large-scale organizations. That tends to be my background, my bias as I talk to people. So we're also going to talk about how does this stuff work in real life, just based on our experience and having done a few hundred engagements in this particular zone. Well, we've done something like 1,200 engagements overall in terms of requirement space. And we're going to talk about positive actions. Anybody who's participated with us in a webinar in the past knows that I don't want to just talk about the sky is falling and crazy things are happening. We want to talk about very positive actions that people can take and take tomorrow to improve your project performance overall. That's going to be the focus, and that will be the focus of the last half of this discussion together with you. Okay, so with that, I'm going to give you one slide here at the beginning of IAG. I'll give you one at the end, and that'll be my advertisement for the day, okay? We are a company that, in a short sense, all we do is requirements discovery and management. That's the only thing we do in life. We're about as narrowly focused as you could possibly make a professional services organization. I finally updated my slide here. We've done something like 1,200 requirements projects. Really, there's a couple of takeaways from this particular slide. We tend to work, and our bias is that we work from very large-scale projects or tend to be engaged in larger-scale projects. People tend not to call me up and say, hey, Keith, I got an easy one for you today. So we tend to work with fairly large organizations who are trying to bring a lot more consistency to their execution approach. We have a lot of success in helping people to internalize that capability into the organization, training something in excess of 15, 20,000 business analysts over the years, and helping organizations to adopt much better and more systematic approaches to getting requirements or getting projects delivered more successfully. And we spend a lot of time researching what are best practices out there, testing those best practices, working with organizations on those best practices to say, hey, what's working, what's not working. I know the guys, when we put this thing together, wanted me to make the Agile Alliance thing on the left-hand side of the bottom there extremely large, but I don't want to kind of offset that against all the other partners that we work with and the technologies that we bring to the table when we're working with an organization. So with that kind of context, here's the learning objectives. And by the way, if I don't hit these objectives, you can send me your cranky email, because they've got my email address right at the beginning, right at the end for you. But send me an email and we can adjust this discussion for future times when I go through it with people. But we're going to really look at the structure of agility and discipline-based methods. In fact, we're going to expand that whole discussion out and really look at the structure of system development methods broadly, not to beat it to death, but let's kind of back this up. Take a look from a management perspective, because there's a whole lot of material out there from an individual tactics perspective, but let's take it really from an executive and management perspective. What are we really trying to achieve here, and how are we going to go about doing that? That's really the first activity. And then secondly, let's get down into what are some guidelines around the specific areas of agile practices that you can kind of bring into more traditional development approaches to make them more agile, to make them faster, more iterative, these other kinds of things. And then what are some guidelines for applying some traditional practices into the agile environment? And let's kind of look at this as a way of harmonizing practices that are out there. Now, what I do want to do is start with the poll here fairly quickly. And the poll is really to help me understand who is on the line here. What statement do you most agree with? And this can help me kind of tune my approach as I'm going through the dialogue with people. Agile is a new world. Hey, get with the program. We change our methods on every project. There's a lot of organizations out there who do that. You've got a whole series of issues that you're trying to deal with. We've got very strict standards for software requirements development and project planning, so you're very plan-driven. There's lots of emerging ways to do things. We're experimenting with lots of different things. So just take a minute. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to end that poll now. Hopefully everybody can see it. But basically we've got the majority of people are changing their projects or their methods a lot, and they've got fairly strict standards. And that's because I think so many of the people who are participating in this discussion are coming from it more from a traditional plan-based approach. But there really are a tremendous number of net new and emerging methodologies and approaches that can be used. And some of them are very, very successful. And Agile can be very successful, very scalable, and certainly we've used it in that way. So let's talk about some of these different things. And first and foremost, let's really dispel some of those myths and misconceptions that exist around methods and practices that are out there. And I'm going to start with Waterfall, just because it's the evil brother, I guess. Everybody seems to have called it that anyway. But when you look at this was really developed back in the 70s as a reaction to code and fix, which was a relevant methodology at the time. And this gentleman, Royce, Winston Royce, who developed this, had a couple of elements in Waterfall that he thought were very central to the approach. One was iteration and evolutionary development. And the other thing was prototyping. Basically saying prototyping should be as much as 1/3 of the project effort. Fascinating. I mean, there are elements in that approach, but what happened is as people got into implementing this approach, the value system of we need to plan and really need to focus heavily on planning overcame some of the technique elements that were central to the effectiveness of this and pushed it into something that people have basically said, no, we don't want to do that anymore. Let's take a look at Agile type approach. The concept of Scrum was actually first introduced in '86, and this was introduced actually out of Japan in an approach to try to bring products to market faster. Now, it wasn't really formalized into a software development methodology until Schwaber and Sutherland got a hold of it in 1995. But fantastic thinking behind this whole methodology and the concepts there. But what Agile does that's so exciting is it very rigidly controls certain elements. It's not prescriptive in terms of technique, but these particular methods are more prescriptive in that it's rigidly controlling certain elements in it that are actually fairly requirements related. Pre-game planning, sprint planning, stakeholder participation, how you do that, the scrum meetings, et cetera, associated with that, tend to be very prescriptive and very requirements driven. So that, yes, you're driving it through a collaborative environment, but you're prescribing, these certain types of meetings and what you're going to talk about and how you're going to drive that through. So it's not that Agile does not have requirements. I mean, certainly XP will thin that out more so than some of the other methodologies. But use cases, for example, are promoted in many of the variants of Agile, even though you're using something called the user story and mainly as a standard in many other ones. So it's a misconception to say that Agile does not have a very, very high degree of discipline when it is being executed correctly. It doesn't. It's a very disciplined approach when you're pushing it into execution. So people tend to think of Agile as kind of cowboy coding, and it's really not. You have to get beyond that kind of thinking. Okay, you have to get really beyond that kind of thinking, because what makes it that way, what people do with it and why people interpret it that way, is because, again, it's the value system behind it, the value system getting misinterpreted. Now, Agile also has another unique thing that kind of transformed this as a methodology and transformed this as a market movement, because the manifesto was published in around 2001. And this is unlike any other kind of modern movement, if you want to call it, from a methods perspective, because 17 very, very sharp methodologists all got together and said, hey, this is what we believe in. This is what we're going to endorse. This is what we're going to call as a concept. This is what Agile means. And that's never really happened before, right? I mean, you've got, Object, and some of these other kinds of things that kind of pushing and a little slower, but this particular one's got a lot of traction because it's one of those first times when something really, really started to galvanize like this. And it's different. It's different because it starts to force value system, and that value system starts getting adopted, and it's the value system that sometimes gets pushed a little too far and starts polarizing the way people go about implementing. And that's why I think it's important to bring it back to saying, what is it that people are trying to do? What you're trying to do is produce working software. And I'm hoping people are going to agree with me on these points. Produce working software, get productive use of resources, prioritize and build what's actually needed for the organization, and build it efficiently and with transparency. And what I mean by transparency, because that's kind of an unusual word in there, it means you can actually look at it and you can manage it, you can govern it. You don't have to kind of accept black box development and say, oh yeah, you guys develop when you all get done and give it back to me and we're all good. That doesn't work. It has to have some transparency, and Agile is very good about that, right? It's with the whole idea of sprints and things like this. So, but let's agree on what people are trying to do. This is what people are trying to do at the end of the day. And it's that all methods, regardless of the type or the style, are trying to achieve this kind of very similar result. In fact, what I'm going to say is, like, if you had to put a single word on this, Agile, wonderful, it's a single word. Let's try to put a single word on this, and I'm going to say it's satisfaction. You're trying to bring satisfaction to all of the different stakeholders in the organization. Cross-organizational satisfaction is really your goal when you're delivering software. And the reason why I'm beating on this a little bit is because the value system itself sometimes is impeding that goal. It gets in the way. And you have to sit back and say, wait a minute now, what are we really trying to do here? Because if you do that, you'll get a far, far more successful implementation. So let's look at all of these methods in context, because my belief is that really they are not mutually exclusive goals. You have a single goal, and that's trying to get satisfaction across many stakeholders within your organization. If you achieve that, as a CIO, you've got a job there for a long time. If you don't achieve that, then you've got a problem on your hands. So let's visualize this development process. Now, here's something where what we did is we took our own methodology, and this is, a Keith Ellis, IAG coming together, or IAGs kind of looking at the methodology and saying, well, how can we apply this to the world of methodologies that are out there? Okay, and what we do is you just say, okay, look, let's start with how do you elaborate a process? Let's say it's an order. You're taking an order. Well, what information you need to take that order? That's basically the center of the process. You've got information that needs to come in. Where do you get that information from? What's the output? What are you going to do next in that process? What's the output of that particular process? And you've got suppliers and you've got customers, right? So where are you going to get that information from? Are there any people that you have to provide that information to? A fairly basic elaboration methodology here that I'm just using to kind of look at methodologies overall for requirements or for system development. Because when you look underneath the covers of this, what do you value most in completing your process called system development? What do you value most? Do you value manufacturing-like efficiency? Because that's really those planned approaches, right? Do you value clockwork-like releases of new stuff? Because that's the whole Agilist movement, right? It's that whole clock-like work releases of new stuff. You've got methodologies that are very supplier-centric. You're just trying to really maximize that task efficiency. If you're going to go put in SAP or some package, and you've got a methodology that's designed to implement SAP, that's what you're going to go do, right? At least that's the center point of it, if that's really ultimately your goal. And then the customer-centric ones is that whole maximization of solution usability. So what do you value most when you're completing a solution? Take a minute just for yourself. We're not going to open a poll here. Take a minute and write down, what do you think is most important for your organization? Now, some of you, I should pause there while you do that, but I'm going to bet that there's a lot of you that are sitting in a room of 10 people. And I'm going to bet that every single one of you, well, some of you wrote down the same thing a couple of times because just mathematically you have to do that. But I'm going to bet you had the same distribution as we had on those earlier slides, with maybe a third, or 25, 25% kind of selecting different ones. Because each of you will gravitate naturally to a different value system. It's the passion underneath that value system that drives polarization in methodology implementation. That's the challenge. As soon as you start saying, I am going to go manufacturing-like efficiency at the expense of other things, you get polarization. You get, look, I'm going to be so focused on making sure that these documents are perfect before I go in that I'm going to make it difficult for my suppliers, my IT organization. I'm going to make it difficult for my customers because they may not necessarily get what they want, and I'm going to make it difficult to actually get this output completed. You get so focused on the supplier efficiency, you get so focused on implementing SAP that you lose sight of, hey, my customers are actually going to have to use this thing. This actually has to match with my business needs in some way, and the output has to be usable. If you get so overwhelmingly focused on one of these value system elements, what happens? You start to get polarization. And that polarization leads to a breakdown in methodology efficiency. That's my belief as we go forward. Let's take a look at the manifesto. Okay, because this is a wonderful example of the people who put this together, absolutely brilliant, and certainly you have to endorse the thinking that's behind this because it's fantastic. The idea of the manifesto is that it's a value system, and they very rightly perceived it as a value system. The work we have come to value is that individuals and interactions over processes and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation, customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And it's not that the things that were on the right are not valuable. It's just that they value the things on the left more. And that's a common misperception when you're going through and doing any kind of Agilist type of movement. People will say, well, listen, we need to remove our business analysts from here. And you just kind of laugh. For a larger organization, because if you go and shoot those guys, you now have no or limited ability to help your organization really take in a lot of what has to be requirements of the organization. And it's really counterproductive in the long run to achieving a scalable organization that's going to be repeatedly delivering high-quality code. Let's take this one step further, okay? Let's take all of the methodologies that we can kind of look at And I want you to plot for yourself where you think they fit in this grid. Okay? Now, I've started it, but I don't want to get into a long-winded argument with people about where different methodologies fit. But I'm going to show you some examples of what's out there. Because for yourself, and here's a challenge for you, if I'm right, and this is a continuum, that really methodologies and software development is all about selecting techniques that help you make sure that you deliver effectively, that you're gaining cross-functional organizational satisfaction with the performance of the IT organization. If it's all about that, then you should be able to select techniques from any of these types of methods, be able to incorporate them into what you're doing as long as you're solving a valid problem, and you'll get improvement in performance. So let's take a look at some of the methods. Just some examples. Okay, input. I mean, the classic is going to be Waterfall that everybody's kind of demonized. Department of Defense, obviously, the classic one in there, or NASA, et cetera. Customer-oriented ones, and this is one that people say, well, what are you talking about? Spiral. The spiral methodology has been around for a long time. The reality of that was it's a much more customer-centric because you're really continuously evolving the interface that people are going to be using. That's how that methodology actually ended up in real life being used. Mashups, which is this current kind of funky thing. Visualization-based methods where you're really driving the requirements through the interface and evolving how that interface is going to be used. Visualization methods also heavily in the usability space when you're dealing with call center systems or these other types of systems where you've got very, very high amount of transactions processing through the system. Where what I mean by transaction is a human-computer interaction type of transaction. Output-like methodology, clearly Agile. And all the Agile variants would fit in there. And then the supplier base. So if you're doing, you're implementing Oracle or you're implementing SAP, you've got Oracle AAM or ASAP. Those are clearly supplier-based. But you can also interpret supplier as, hey, something that's very IT-centric, extremely IT-centric. So it's really the IT organization that's provisioning services. That would also be a supplier-based because you're really trying to maximize task efficiency. And there are variants, right? So the variants of Agile, XP, Scrum, FDD, feature-driven development, dynamic system development methods, these are all variants. And again, any of you can argue where that dot should go. And I would encourage you to look underneath the covers of the methodology and say, well, where should that dot go? Based on what you know about that methodology and how well it fits various pieces in here. But you've got others like CMMI, the model, which was a response to people delivering, very, very high-quality input documents, but not really connecting it to, the testing protocols that really say, hey, is the customer getting what they're supposed to be getting? RAD. As other kinds of methodologies, you've also got organizations who are defining, for example, a common, say, utility model or something like that, which might fit in the upper left-hand corner. So you've got a lot of different approaches that are out there. All of them are valid. And what I challenge you is, where is your starting point? Because if you're dealing with a smaller number of very, very large-scale systems where you've got high risk, very high accountability, you've got issues of governance, so very high non-functional related challenges that you've got to deal with, well, where's your starting point likely to be? Likely it's going to be more input-oriented because you've got to really control making sure you hit all of those issues as you go through and you're not missing something. If you're output-oriented, you've got a different kind of organization. You're a very, very large volume of smaller enhancements or features that you're trying to add to something. You're not naturally trying to break a very, very large thing into extremely small things. And software development shops, naturally you're going to gravitate to this thing and do very, very well with that kind of methodology structure. And that's the starting point, right? The supplier side, if you're trying to do application integration or selection, your natural tendency is to try to go to a methodology that's designed principally for that. And now, then that depends. Like, you got to make a choice. Is your goal simply to implement SAP? Because if it is, then you're going to gravitate to that methodology. Is your goal instead to maximize or change or implement a common best practices for your organization? Because if that's the case, if you want to get to a common model of processes for your organization, you might go more input-oriented because that's better designed as a basic structure for your organization. at that point in time. Customer-centric, again, web-based systems fit this, decision support systems fit this, call centers, police systems where you've got very high numbers of interactions of an individual with a system. Okay? Those kinds of things. But my point to you is this. If I'm right, and this is really just one big kind of continuum, then what you're able to do or should be able to do, assuming you've got a valid problem with your method, like don't go trying to fix problems that don't exist by adding and changing methods. But if you've got a challenge in an Agile approach, you should be able to reach and pick out elements of any of these other approaches, techniques that work well in these other approaches, and apply it to your Agile approach and get a far better performance as a result of that. And certainly that's what we do. When we're driving very, very high, we go into an organization, and IAG historically has driven something in excess of 60%, something like that, performance gains. You're not going to get that simply by, religiously trying to implement one-size-fits-all thing, especially into a very large-scale organization. It's just not going to work. What you have to do is selectively look at what are the issues of this organization. How do I tune what I'm doing here to get better success overall? Because by doing that, what you're doing is you're taking into account that kind of missing link. That missing link is that you're trying to ultimately focus on cross-organizational satisfaction. That is, at the end of the day, what you're trying to do. So you're going to pull from these other value system areas. You're going to help take into account more of what the customer is looking for, more of what your supplier is looking for in terms of task efficiency, more of, hey, let's control these inputs so that we're making sure we're getting better processing all the way through this process. All of those kinds of value systems are very valid. And when you do that, what you're doing is you're pulling naturally those methods towards the center. You're pulling them towards the center as you pull up on that string called cross-organizational satisfaction. The more you pull on that, the more the methodology will pull towards the center. Therefore, it's less polarized. Tendency then is to get far, far better implementation on the way through. So here's some messages I want you to repeat, and you're going to end up repeating them, if you're a believer, over and over and over again. Here's the difficulty with methodologies. They're based on a value system. You can't argue with that value system. You really can't, because task efficiency is really important. Clockwork-like releases of new stuff is really important. Maximizing solution usability is really important. Manufacturing-like efficiency is really important. You can't really say, oh, this one here is so much more important than that one there over a long period of time within a corporation. It's just not reasonable. Okay? People don't sit still that long. So it's all a single spectrum of methodologies trying to achieve the same goal. Focus on that same goal. How do you get there? Don't be so religious about it. The second thing is, being rigid in the application of the value system behind the method, it leads to polarization. Polarization is a bad thing. Especially, now let's get away from little onesie-twosies, okay? Like, if you have somebody who is an Agilist and they're one person in an organization, and perhaps you have a larger organization, then you know what? Hey, you're not as concerned about that. What you're concerned about is when you're applying this to very, very large-scale organizations, where you're trying to get consistency in execution. And you're dealing with hundreds and hundreds of user stories, not onesies, twosies. You're dealing with hundreds and thousands of projects, not just onesies and twosies. You see, it's not about, when you're getting to kind of what we deal with and what many of you on the line are dealing with, you're dealing with scale. And when you're dealing with organizational scale and significance, then you have to kind of change the rules. You can't be so polarized. You have to take into account many different value systems as you're trying to go forward and deliver. And that becomes the challenge. So let's talk about harmonizing agility and discipline, because clearly there are many, many of you out there. In fact, 50% of you out there are looking at and experimenting with new methodologies. You're experimenting with new approaches. You're committed to Agile. You're committed to these other kinds of things. And you want those things to be successful. We all want them to be successful. You want them to be successful. And there's some very, very large companies that are committing to doing some of these new approaches, and sometimes we know that they're getting a little over-religious about it. Let me point that to this way. Two organizations implementing exactly the same methodology. Two organizations, exactly the same methodology. They have exactly or very similar issues underlying their organization. Is it possible for those two organizations to have radically different outcomes and experiences with the implementation of that methodology? Is it possible? Write it out on a sheet of paper. Yes? No? 90% of you will say yes. Why? Because they're not taking into account certain basic issues that you have to wrestle with when you're dealing with satisfaction. Okay? And these are some, regardless of whatever method you implement, I don't care what it is, you need to deal with these 5 things, okay? The job roles, the scope of competency required to have an effective employee versus the span of responsibility to get a motivated employee. It's a kind of complex, convoluted sentence, but this is what it means. Let's actually take it into an Agile world. In an Agile world, you actually have a tremendous scope of accountability or competency that you're expecting into your senior delivery people. You've got them to be potentially project managers, developers, business analysts, and testers. Okay, potentially you've got those 4 scope of responsibility in a very, very large-scale environment, or in when you're dealing with smaller functions that you're trying to implement into the organization, and you've got very, very high expert people who are focusing on a single system, you can achieve that very, very well. And the span of responsibility is such that they are very motivated because they are now accountable for elements of code that's being delivered. So you've got a sense of ownership, and you've got the sense of team and a sense of accomplishment as you're delivering that. But if you explode the size or magnitude, and all of a sudden they don't have the competencies to do the elicitation the way they need to be the analyst they need to. It's too big. They can't project manage it. They can't break it into pieces. It comes at them in a way that's just so unusual they're not able to deal with it. And it becomes quite demotivating. And so you have to kind of gently balance, what is it that we're trying to do here? Do our people have the requisite competencies that we need to go with one methodology versus another? Because if they don't, the scope of competency required to be effective breaks down and immediately begin to fail. But similarly, organizations on the other side, we've seen it many times where they've set their scope of responsibility so narrow for people that it becomes very demotivating, because the inputs that they're getting they're all over the place, and people can hand off poor quality work to other organizations, and there's no repercussion. So you get all kinds of problems. So the job role and the design around that and how you're manufacturing that within your organization is critical to increasing overall satisfaction, generally within the organization. How do you get efficient customer participation? And how effective is the approach to elicitation within the methodology that you're working with? It's all fine and dandy to say, hey, our developers are going to engage with customers, and they're going to be locked at the hip, and their customers are going to be right in the kitchen cooking up the code with us. But the developers just don't have the requisite skills to do that, and they don't know the questions to ask, and they don't know how to go about asking those questions. How likely are you to succeed with that? I mean, you're going to get cooked. It's just a matter of time, right? You have to reverse that. You have to say, listen, we need to be effective at this. We need efficient customer participation. If we're inefficient at that, people are going to get mad. They're just not going to participate with us over time. We're going to fail. You got to deal with that up front. How are you going to do that? Scalability and volume, process repeatability. How do you deal with volume? You see, it's all cool to say I've got a couple of projects I need to deliver, and everything's a process of one. The challenge for organizations is maturity. It's how do you effectively deal with many, many, many? Because that will change the solution that you implement. If you're just focused on, let's be religious about this, we're going Agile, or we're going to improve the discipline, we're tired of Agile, it failed, and we've got to go this other direction, whatever you're doing, if you think of it in terms of, hey, we're doing lots of these things, then it changes your thinking, and you start doing things differently. And because it changes your thinking, because you do things differently, and you think about huge numbers as you're going through it, you will probably implement something that's more successful. Institutionalizing success. In a lot of your organizations, every single project you look at is an exception to whatever logic was set up for how you go about doing projects. Everything is different. happens in engineering companies a lot, actually. Because it's just, for whatever reason, there's got to be a lot of creativity around how you do projects. But if that's the case, it's very difficult to institutionalize success. How do you set up standards where, yes, we have individual accountability. Yes, individually you've got latitude to execute with situational awareness. Yes, you are ultimately accountable for delivering this. But hey, we're operating within a framework here that we know is successful, it's going to work, because we need to institutionalize that success. We need to repeatably make sure that things are being delivered successfully. And that's a challenge for a lot of organizations. And finally, objective success. How do you know, underscore in caps, your customers got or is getting what they wanted? And that's a challenge for any organization. And you have to define that for yourself. So sit down with any methodology that you want to look at, any of them, and define for yourself these 5 things. Answer those questions. And by the way, take it out into a broader context within the organization, because it takes you away from the passion of the method. It takes you away from the rigidity of the structures and gets you into something that's going to be a little bit more effective. Now let's turn the implementation of this down into a specific framework, because I want to bring this from the high level, because right now we're at 20,000 feet. I got to get right down into the grassroots a little bit here, okay? Because there's certain techniques that you can use, but we're not going to run around with an elephant gun looking for a pinhead. You know what I mean? We don't want to do that. You want to make sure that you're surgically correcting issues. You don't want to manufacture issues or defects in your methodology. If you can get away and put in a Scrum or XP or some other methodology that's working well, and man, it's just working well for your organization, that's great. It's more vanilla. It's better. It's okay. If instead, and because you're a large organization, this will happen, you're finding issues, then what you start to do is just say, okay, well, look, let's tune this in a way that's really going to work for our organization over time. Let's get in here and start to make sure that the methodology that we put in place is optimized for our organization's culture and success. And here's where, let's not focus on the negatives, okay? I'm going to focus only on the positives. That's just kind of my mindset. We always focus on the positives. Look at the strengths of the input plan-driven approach. They have strengths, believe it or not. Even though you never want a waterfall flowing through your office, there's certain things about waterfalls that are pretty. The next thing is, there are certain strengths of the Agile or output-driven approaches. They are extremely strong in certain areas. Let's look at how, if you're running Agile, can you capitalize on those strengths of a plan-driven approach? Because I'm betting that if you're running an Agile approach, some of you have had these kinds of problems. Do you ever have problems because the context of the what's required is just not there? Do you ever deliver pieces of that application and find out later that the interdependencies between that piece and another piece cause you to throw out a whole lot more than you ever intended? Do you ever have problems that you're just not getting reusability of the models that are being delivered? In fact, you're not getting a centralized model at all. In fact, your documentation is just not coming together for you in a way that's reasonable. Do you ever get worried about that at night? Do you ever have a problem with capturing non-functional requirements? You're delivering systems, and all of a sudden the security requirements are just not being met, and you're not testing for those, and all of a sudden there's gaps? Oops. Especially in today's market, because people are pretty litigious about that sort of stuff, right? On the other side, if you're in the world of plan-driven, have you ever had problems with integrating change and being able to manage that? I'm sure we're all excellent at it. We call that scope creep, right? But maybe there's better ways of going about doing that, because you may have had problems with actually getting a reasonable or fast release cycle. Is it just taking you forever to do something? Have you ever had problems trying to get customers to participate in your discovery sessions or participate in the development of your requirements? Think about it from a strengths perspective. The strengths of Agile are extremely good. I mean, this is a wonderful methodology for certain kinds of things. There are wonderful techniques in there. And you can lift out some of those techniques and bring them into a plan-based approach. Why? Because you want to execute with satisfaction. You want people more satisfied with what it is that you're delivering. And let's take a look at this, because harmonizing is really all about creating synergy, right? It's all about bringing together the elements of both of these methods. It's a single spectrum. Bring together the elements of the methods, make them more successful. So let's talk about applying Agile principles to plan-driven approaches, and then I'll flip it around and talk about the other one, okay? So here, remember from that chart, we're going to embrace and manage change. We're embracing change here, which is difficult in larger companies. We're going to demonstrate value repeatedly and have faster release cycles, and we're going to focus in on customer participation by design. Now, I am going to pull out, because this is a webinar, and we're only dealing with a half an hour to make, 20 minutes now to make some recommendations. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. Issue is, I'm going to focus on simple things that people can do tomorrow to hopefully help them adjust and make some significant changes to their approach. Simple things. When you come and work with us, maybe there's more complex things that we have to do, but we're not going to diagnose that in 2 seconds in a webinar like this. Let's go through and talk about these individual things. So here's a common problem, okay? Embrace and manage change. A lot of times your documentation standards include, like when you look underneath the covers of the documentation, it's actually got a business requirement document and a requirement specification and a systems specification all in one document. So an analyst, to be effective, has to deliver all 3 of those pieces at once, just to actually get a piece of, just to get the requirements out to a point where you can actually push it in development. Here's a very simple change that will help you really embrace and manage change much more efficiently. Because if you do it this way, people kind of think that they're going to miss their opportunity, or they're going to look at it and they're not going to understand the implications, and you get all kinds of issues around that. If you change it a little bit and you say, separate these things out into 3 separate things: business requirement document, requirement specification, system specification. If you just change that one little thing, you can actually get a very significant performance boost. We did this at one of the major banks. Just help them separate business requirement document and requirement specification. And we did that one change in one project. They came back to us and said, you guys helped us save $650,000. $650,000. That's a lot of change on one little thing. Why? Because it helps people think things through easier, and you get better iteration on the methodology. You get better iteration on how you're going about evolving the concept of what it is you're trying to deliver and what elements are important. Again, a simple change. Break those 2 apart, and you will get better performance in your methodology. Demonstrating value repeatedly. So let me ask you guys a question. How long does it take you, and this is the plan-based people, not so much the Agile guys, how long does it take you to organize a big project? I'm talking about a $5 to $10 million thing. How long does it take you to organize that? That's like asking how long the length of the string is. Okay, the last time you did it, how long did it take? I'm going to bet most of you it rattled around the organization for a long time. It just, people had real trouble trying to get it from concept down into something that was extremely well specified and actually broken into pieces. Now, here's something that's kind of neat. Agilists don't have this problem. Why? Because they're trained naturally. The whole mindset is, how do I break this thing into as many pieces as I possibly can? What are the elements of it? And it just, it's a totally different mindset. So how long does it take you to break it into pieces? If you adopt a different approach, adopting an Agilist approach, you start picking up techniques that are oriented purely at scalping, oriented purely at understanding projects, defining them to a moderate degree, not in detail at all, just a moderate degree, so you understand what these pieces generally are, getting that out, and now you know that you can break it down into pieces, and those become digestible chunks. Here's 2 examples, and these are huge. This is a food and beverage company, Fortune 100 manufacturer. They're trying to do an overhaul of all supply chain systems. So that means supply chain management, traffic and transport, the CRM systems, production planning, forecasting, marketing, sales, operations. Okay, hopefully that kind of paints a picture of the scope. Big. Now, what we helped them do was break that into 12 projects, and we did it in less than 2 weeks. You see, when you're into very large companies and you're into a plan-driven kind of mentality, you start going down the path of, well, what are all the implications? What's interacting with this? What's interacting with that? What's interacting with these other things? And it becomes very difficult to get a plan in place unless you're adopting more Agilist thinking, which is, wait a minute now, that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is, at a very etch-a-sketch level, define this thing. What is it that we're trying to implement here? Based on that definition, start breaking it into pieces, and then really define those other pieces in a much more collaborative environment. And that's what we brought to this particular organization. We did another one, which is actually an ERP, global ERP implementation. And what we were able to do there was, because it's a global ERP, Fortune 500 manufacturer, break it into digestible pieces in about 3 weeks. Now, the neat thing about that particular one is that we were able to help them in the first instance of it get the warehouse management system in place and functioning and on time and on budget. Okay, well, plus or minus 10%, okay, within 8 months. So you can change the thinking, and you can apply very agilist principles to plan-driven approaches and drive the release cycle much differently. People try to do this in real life. People want to do more staged delivery. The problem is, how do you do it? And this is an execution path for you. Think about it this way, and all of a sudden it becomes much easier to execute on. And that's the challenge is, how do you make it happen in real life? Customer participation by design. I mean, when you ever have these problems, you can't get sufficient time with stakeholders, you're having trouble getting sign-off on requirements, you can only get people for 1 hour at a time. I mean, this is stuff that kills you if you're a plan-driven approach. It takes you, on average, 3 times as long to go get the requirements if you're facing these kinds of problems. But what have Agilists done? That's wonderful. It's the whole idea of the customer in the kitchen. The customer in the kitchen is a wonderful way of saying, you are stuck with me by my side as I go build this thing for you. That's what they've done. It's a fantastic thing. What you've done is you've pre-subscribed that if I'm going to go build this thing for you, you are going to be there with me as I go do this so that we can have that interaction. Why aren't you doing this on the plan-driven side? So take from that concept, take from the concepts of Agilist thinking, take how do you do your requirements planning? Here, and say to people, here's what your participation level needs to be, here's what you need to participate, and here's how we're going to participate with you as you do this thing. And if they don't sign off on the plan, well, you don't do it. It's that straightforward. Because that's much more Agilist thinking, is that you're presetting some of these requirements right up front. Okay? Now let's talk about the flip side of that, applying the plan-driven principles to Agile approaches. Now this sounds like sacrilegion here, and I'm sure I'm going to have lots of questions. Okay, Keith, what's wrong with your head? But let's talk about this, because at the end of the day, what you're shooting for is something that's much, much more effective and efficient. We're not trying to be purists here. We're just trying to be successful and drive higher levels of satisfaction. So 3 things, remember from the prior slide: defining the context, requirements in context, using models to communicate, and planning to capture non-functional requirements. These are the things that drive Agilist batty, okay? So, defining requirements in context. One organization we were working with had a backlog, I think it was something like 800 stories. It might have been 1,800, but something like that they were working with. Huge, okay, fairly significant organization. And they had a couple of problems with this, 3 in particular. One is, what's the sequence of these things? Because you've got so many of these things, how do you break it into, you've got well more than, one flight plan here. So, it's got a problem. So how do you sequence these things so it actually becomes very productive? The second thing they had a problem with is a lot of the cards that they were getting, the user stories that they were getting, really, you had no idea what it was that you're trying to, you read these things and you had no idea what it is that's trying to deliver. It doesn't make sense. And it's true that their customers were coming up with the features, and this is a little bit more of a software development organization. So, the features that they're coming up with, they should have been fairly clear. I mean, you'd think that they would be that way, but, it just wasn't. The next thing is you had an issue is that they had risk to architecture or real significant cross-functional impact on a number of these things. So what do you do in that circumstance? Because you don't want to break the architecture. Okay, we had one client I was working with that many years ago that they had an Agilist working in the organization, and they fundamentally redesigned the software in such a way that there were actually little switches that they could turn on and off that would make the software work fundamentally different for each client. And this was an ASP. So when they went to redeploy it, and this fellow had left the organization, when they went to redeploy the system, they just couldn't. And they spent millions of dollars trying to figure out what this person had done and how was adjusting the code for each of the individual clients and all these sorts of things. Why? Because that person had fundamentally changed the architecture of this thing, right? And not documented it. So what we were talking about, and what we implemented with this one company that had the 800 stories or so, is we said, look, you always have to have a user acceptance test on a user story. Why? Because that clarifies what that person is talking about. What is it that's going to make you successful? What is it going to make this thing successful? The second thing we said is use cases augment user stories with both context and they help set the sequence. Because what was happening is people, when they're interpreting this discussion, you take a card, you read it, and you say, okay, is this making sense to me or not? Do I know what this thing is? If it's not, then put it back, do the use case around it. The second thing is it really, really helps with sequencing because a use case is naturally sequenced. You've got step 1 of the process, step 2 of the process, step 3 of the process, step 4 of the process, step 5. And when you're doing your scheduling, when you're looking at driving this through the organization, you really need to make sure that you're driving the ones in the first step first and the ones in the second step stack. The problem is with the user story is that it's like a step in a use case. You don't necessarily know where that is in the context of the broader process, so you can fix that. Use cases help you do that. The last thing we did is said, listen, just do this. Put together a master context diagram for the system, and then every time you've got one of these things that comes out, take it and evaluate it against the master context diagram. Say, well, where is this feature actually hitting and how? And if it's hitting across a bunch of them, pull that card out, go get clarity before you start putting it back in. Because it's probably going to be more than one. It's probably going to be more than one story going through this thing. It's hitting across a bunch of areas. We've got to make sure that we're dealing with the risk to architecture and risk to cross-functional impact before we get crazy here. The next thing we did is, okay, let's look at using models to communicate. So in this particular case here, and this is a different client, they were losing control of system changes. Basically, there are higher degrees of turnover than they should have had in their organization. Point activities were not in context for stakeholders, so what was happening is they were going through the development activity, and the content coming out was filling the user story, but it wasn't actually what they're looking for. So the issues was that the context was not being managed properly. So what we realized is that the problem was that the organization was not developing in context to the processes that were trying to be developed. And so here's one case where you really need to use models to communicate. Okay, and so here what we had to go to is actually model-driven development. And I know it's a little bit counter-agilist, okay, but it created a single center of truth for the system as a whole. And the models in development basically then became simultaneous because you're doing development right within a system, and then you're basically taking those models and sharing those with the customer as you're talking about needs and requirements. Now, to do this effectively, you really need to customize the package. You absolutely have to customize that package because, I don't care who you are. If you take out a sequence diagram to a business stakeholder, their brain is going to melt. You can't take purist UML diagrams or some of these other sorts of things out to these people and expect them to understand it. And you can't get so married to the diagram standards of the package that you're using, okay, or it's going to be ineffective. What we had to do here is actually use an activity diagram, reformat it to show swim lanes. And once we did that, then all of a sudden the stakeholder said, yeah, I really love this thing. I now understand what it is that we're doing from a processing perspective. I now understand that what I'm trying to develop is in context. I'm not going to mess up my process here because the process itself was so critical, and it had some governance associated with it. Was pretty important to manage. So as a result, you got a much higher and much better quality implementation. Planning and capturing non-functional requirements, a very challenging problem. And here's some questions that we got. Am I allowed to capture non-functional requirements? I mean, people will ask you that as you're kind of going into the coaching, right? Because people think that because we're Agile, we're not documenting, right? People think because we're Agile, we're documenting so thin, we're not documenting these kinds of things. It's a naive question, but it gets asked. Why? Because, people mix the value system with that value system is actually the prescription, or that value system is actually the technique. And that's not the case. And that's what makes polarization happen. So you got to get away from that. Or you get other people say, well, they didn't tell us about that particular issue. And that's also counter to the value system, okay? Because that's kind of coming from a plan-driven approach to an Agile. It's very typical, right? When you go from plan-driven to Agile, you're going to get this kind of issue. Oh, they didn't tell me about that thing. In an Agile world, the development team is accountable for all requirements, assuming that they don't have analysts in there and they don't have project managers that are also working with the team. So if you're purist Agile, that Agile team is accountable. You have to get it right. You either intuit the non-functional requirements or you have techniques that you're going to use to go get them. And you have to rely very heavily on judgment and experience. This is why it doesn't work when you're dealing with shops with high degrees of turnover, much higher complexity, or very, very high degrees of sophistication of the systems that you're delivering, at least process sophistication, okay? It may or may not work in that area. But what we did here is we basically said, okay, you got a choice. You can either create artificial user stories and add that to the stack that's delivered in a sprint. Okay, you can. You can basically say, okay, the non-functional requirement of this kind of security over here, that gets delivered in the sprint. Now, it kind of messes things up a little bit. All of these are just kind of workarounds, okay? They will mess things up a little bit. You can augment the user story cards with a listing of non-functional requirements and constraints. Or the corollary of that is you deliver a different artifact. Now, you're training people to look in a different place. It's just not stuck up on the wall the way it's supposed to be, okay? So people are looking in a different place for stuff. My personal favorite is you strengthen the standards. You change the SLA. You basically say, I've got 3 SLAs for, or whatever it is, for delivering systems. And this works really well when you've got chargeback mechanisms in the organization. And you improve the style guide, right? So and then you train up your development team to know that SLA and style guide, so that if there's exceptions to it, you're reporting it into the user story. But otherwise, it's within this. And that way you can kind of weight the user stories that they're delivering depending on the complexity based on the SLA. So it changes things, right? But it helps you deal with this issue of non-functional requirements a little bit more significantly. Regardless of what you do, the company absolutely must strengthen its testing approach. Why? Devs are human too, man. Devs are human too. You're going to miss this stuff as you're delivering, and especially as you start scaling this into large-scale corporations and more critical application areas. It's not really designed, Agile was never really designed into that area. So you have to strengthen the testing approach and probably pull that and maintain it in a separate organization. Rather than within the Agilist approach, you have that within your unit testing, in your acceptance testing within the Agile group. You probably need to pull that out. You've got to strengthen it, and you've got to train the devs to look for the non-functional requirements, the FERPs, right? Functionality, usability, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So continue that. So closing thoughts, and I'm really pulling close to the very end of this thing. So I want to make sure that we finish on time, and I'll take a couple of minutes afterwards to answer some questions, and then I'll follow up and email them out to people. So, listen, guys, remember, if you take anything away from this discussion at all, remember it's a single spectrum of methods that are all trying to achieve the exact same goal. And I'm going to prove it to you. Pull method techniques out of any conflicting method into your methodology to solve a real legitimate problem, and I bet that your methodology will perform better. It will perform better, okay? You have to take a more balanced perspective. Focus on cross-organizational satisfaction, and you will enhance your methodology performance. We've seen it again and again. So often organizations, they get stuck. They're trying to implement Agile. They're trying to implement RUP. They're trying to implement something else, and they get stuck. Why? Because they're too religious on some aspect of the value system, and they're not getting the techniques in place that are going to help them be successful. Why? Because they, for whatever reason, think those techniques are counter to the methodology. That's not what's important. It's the outcome that's important that you're trying to get to. No matter what you select, there will be those 5 central issues that are going to impact your success. No matter what you do, you're going to get killed if you don't think about those things. And then simple changes, as I've discussed, very simple changes, can sometimes make for extremely significant improvements. Like we've seen 60% performance improvements before, just by implementing some of the things that we've done here. Hundreds of thousands of dollars saved. Why? Because you're not trying to change the world, you're trying to fix individual solutions, and you're trying to tune the method with situational awareness and plug it into the organization to get good success. So, the learning objectives, I hope what I've covered today is that we've looked at the structure of agility and discipline-based methods, and we really talked about the structure of methodologies overall and how they get polarized very quickly by a religious or overly religious focus on certain value systems at the expense of success. Providing some guidelines for adding some Agile principles to traditional software development, and providing some guidelines for reapplying traditional development to Agile. I hope I've covered those 3 today. If I haven't, you can call me up, or you can send me an email and say, hey, Keith, you got to do this differently next time. Last one on IAG, and I'm going to skip over this very quickly because we're out of time. We are an organization that focuses exclusively on requirements discovery management. It's all we do. And we work with companies in a number of different modes, but really we're all about making sure things are clear, accurate, and complete. That's what the religion is within our organization. And with that, thank you very much for your time and effort today and participating in it.